gonna get started here. Welcome to the lecture this evening. Right off the top, unfortunately, Dr. Andrew Caitler, our academic dean, is not here this evening, nor is Dr. David Henderson to introduce you, so I'll be doing all the introductions for you this evening. Welcome. Sadly, this is the last lecture in our CPC3 public lecture series for this year. And for those of you who are new this evening, our desire with these lectures is to reach out to our greater CPC community, that being all of you, and offer an opportunity to dig deeper into theology, tradition, and our times. And in fact, these three aspects, theology, tradition, and our times, make up the three in the CPC3 lectures. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker and the lecture for this evening, but before I bring Dr. Karol Henderson up, I want to first encourage you to check out the previous lectures from this academic year, which you can find on our YouTube channel. It's easily searched as Catholic Pacific College or at Catholic Pacific. Then you can certainly find it, and all of our lectures should be categorized together. I want to encourage you because we've had many wonderful speakers this year delving into, in particular, and it's actually more almost accidentally that it happened, into theological anthropology. And our lecture tonight will be another contribution to that theme. We've had lectures on Scripture as incarnation, the church and human flourishing, who has authority in the church, the eschatological person, and then our last month's lecture touched on sacramentality and human existence. Tonight's lecture, St. John Paul II and the human person, provides us with another valuable facet of the gem we know intimately as the human person, this time through the lens of Pope St. John Paul the Great. As the description for the lecture reads, to understand John Paul II's unique approach to anthropology, we must first understand who he is as a person and what exactly he means when he teaches that the human person cannot live without love and can only discover himself by drawing near to Christ. Our lecturer this evening is Dr. Karol Henderson, who is originally from the Midwest of the United States. She earned her MA and PhD in theology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies in Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C., which makes her a perfect match for tonight's topic. Her main theological interests center around Mariology, the theology of St. John Paul II. And actually, if you do look in our archives of CPC3 lectures, last year, Karol spoke on Mary and John Paul II on a wonderful presentation last year. And she also is interested in anthropological questions concerning existence, sexual difference, and feminism. And she's published with academic journals such as Communio and Humanum. Karol recently moved from the US to Langley, BC with her husband, Dr. David Henderson, who is not here this evening but is home with the kids. He's now in his second year here with CPC, and she moved here with their two young children. And I guess it's no secret they have another one on the way, expecting to join the CPC family as well as the Henderson family in the fall. Next year, actually, Karol will be teaching a course for us in the spring on the theology of Saints John Paul II and Thomas Aquinas. We're excited to have her here with us at CPC and to have her here this evening, so please help me welcome up Dr. Karol Henderson.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about one of my favorite people, St. John Paul II. So St. John Paul II is one of the most influential and important figures of the 20th century. He was the first Polish pope. He helped bring down communism. He initiated a renewal within the church and inspired a whole new generation of Catholics, inspired the term the new evangelization that we're all familiar with today. He spoke 15 languages, and I don't just mean he dabbled in 15 languages, he was fluent in 15 languages, and that doesn't count the languages he dabbled in and knew a bit of. He wrote 14 encyclicals, and he served as pope for 26 years, and he was declared a saint only 9 years after his death, which, you know, if you look at how the church kind of operates with canonizations, is like the fast track, okay? So we can know a lot about him, facts, as it were, and there's plenty of them. Countless biographies, as well as commentaries and articles on his work, attest to this. But as he once personally observed, he said, most people approach him from the outside. He said, I can only be understood from the inside. So our time together this evening is an attempt to do just that, to approach John Paul II from the inside. Only from understanding him from the inside can we truly appreciate him, and I think see the profundity and timeliness of his witness, his legacy, and his thought that he so selflessly gave to the church and to the world. So a bit of a biography, which may be redundant from some people, but it's lovely to always think back on. So if this is old news for you, sorry, but he was born as Karol Wojtyla, so in English that's Charles, and he was known affectionately as Lolek as a boy, which is Charlie, which I just think is adorable when you think of it. On May 18th, 1920, to Karol and Emilia in Wadowice, Poland. He was the youngest of 3 children, but his older sister died before he was even born. And his mother died when he was just 8 years old. From his youth, then, he only had his father and his older brother Edmund, who was a doctor and with whom he was very, very close. But sadly, Edmund too died after he contracted scarlet fever, and this affected Lolek deeply. His father, after experiencing all this death, became a very, extremely pious man, and Karol often found him in prayer. And he later said that seeing his father in prayer every day had an incredible impact on him, on his faith, but also on his vocation. So this, combined with the rich Catholic culture within his native Poland, instilled in him a deep devotion to his faith and faith's indelible place within the heart of human life. As a boy, Karol was bright and an excellent athlete. And as he grew, he developed an interest in theater and discovered to have a remarkable talent as an actor. His future was bright and full of promise, but then of course came the Second World War, which began with the German invasion of Poland in 1939, and this changed everything. Suddenly, this bright young man who had just begun university, like so many of you, and was studying languages, suddenly university was closed. Life had changed, and he was forced to work in a chemical factory. In 1940, while under the Nazi occupation, he met a tailor named Jan Tyranowski, who was a lay mystic, steeped in the Carmelite tradition, and he started these groups what he called the Living Rosary groups, which were essentially these groups of 10 young people who would accompany each other and try to encourage each other in their faith. And so it became an opportunity for Jan Tyranowski to help form them and accompany these young people within this tumultuous time in Poland. And this was a bit unorthodox. Usually at the time, a priest or a religious would kind of undertake a movement like that. But it was providential because so many priests and religious were sent off to concentration camps, and the faithful were left shepherdless. And so the formation that Karol received from this unassuming layman changed his life, and perhaps we could say even that of the church. In 1941, Karol's father too died, leaving Karol the only member of his immediate family still alive. He said, "I had never felt so alone. At 20, I had already lost all the people that I love." I mean, can you imagine? It's like incredible. Also, like, fair warning, I love JP2, and whenever I hear or read a quote, it cuts me, and I can get emotional, but then add to it that I haven't slept in 3 years because I have 2 toddlers, and that I'm pregnant. If you catch me like, oh, that's why. But also, I think it does attest to just how, just how not cutting, because that's kind of a negative connotation, but just how inspired his words are, and how moving they are, and how even just by, his words he gave at a World Youth Day or his presence, he could inspire a conversion in someone in a brief encounter, They're so rich there, but if you do see me, just ignore me. I'm fine. So, yeah, he had said, at 20, I had already lost all the people that I love. Now, in facing so much suffering and death in a young life, and that's along with living under the Nazi occupation, most of us would probably become bitter and self-destructive, and perhaps even lose their faith. But that didn't happen with him, which is incredible and like a singular grace, really, that didn't happen to him. At this time when he felt so alone, he became closer with Jan Taranowski, and through him encountered the great Carmelite mystic, St. John of the Cross. And he later described St. John of the Cross as his lifelong friend and guide. He ended up writing his doctoral dissertation on him too. So the centrality of St. John of the Cross to him is really, really important, although you don't see him talk about him all that much, but it's really important to him. St. John of the Cross's spirituality is marked by what he calls the dark night of faith. By this, St. John of the Cross means that the human person is inherently spousal in our relationship to God. He calls the soul the bride of Christ. Whether you're a man or a woman, that's our posture before God. And that we exist in a loving communion with God that demands a total gift of ourself to him. But that also receives the total gift of God. For John of the Cross, the experience of suffering in this life is inevitable. But rather than being a hindrance to our communion with God, it can become that which allows us to give ourselves completely to God and where we can receive the gift of God. So in the dark night of faith, John of the Cross taught that we cannot see God, we cannot know him or even feel him. All we kind of know and experience is suffering and darkness. And yet, John of the Cross says that experience of not feeling or knowing God at all is a call to a deeper communion with God, a circumstance that allows us to give ourselves more entirely to God, because it requires this total dying of ourselves to our kind of limit of how we understand things or how we think things should be, and handing ourselves over to God in abandonment. The great 20th century theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar kind of summed up John of the Cross by saying, everything is gained when everything is abandoned. Like when you give everything over to God in that abandonment, God comes. And that's the mystery of the dark night of faith and suffering for him. And so because God always comes in that gesture we make to give ourselves to him, love grows more and more in our hearts, even in this experience of darkness and suffering. So in learning this with St. John of the Cross, Karol was able to take his sufferings and channel them in prayer. And he discovered that even the darkest of human suffering is transformative, and developed this conviction that goodness always prevails, that God always comes, because God is present with us even in our sufferings. And he carried this conviction, this Christian hope with him forward into the rest of his life. And really developed in him a mystical relationship with God, which I'll get more into later. So from this point of conversion, and again, he was always a practicing Catholic, but this moment of encounter with John of the Cross became a moment of ever deepened conversion in him. Karol gave himself entirely to God precisely where he was at in his life. He fought back, as it were, against the evil and the suffering that surrounded him. So how did he do that at 21 years old? Well, in two ways. First, he founded and participated in an underground theater in Krakow. Now, this probably seems a little unusual to many of us. When you think of fighting back against evil, and specifically against Nazis, you think of covert operations, secret messages, various acts of subversion. You don't think of someone starting an underground theater group. It seems a little contrary or just superfluous. But that's what he did. And it's because he and his friends rightly understood that the Nazis were intent on destroying Polish culture and any remnant of human culture at that. And the way you destroy culture is by removing religious figures, so sending priests and religious to concentration camps, for example, and you destroy art. So plays and literature, which are really, that's the form of art that gets at human drama and what it means to be a person relationship, a person acting in the world. They were banned under the Nazi occupation. So Karol and his friends understood the importance of keeping culture alive and keeping, these works of art that attest to the dignity of the human person alive. And the centrality that literature and theater hold in preserving humanity. So they risk their lives by performing plays in people's homes and apartments, which is, really incredible. We'll come back to the significance of that later. And the second way he gave himself to God and kind of fighting back against the evil around him is he eventually discerned God's call to the priesthood, and he entered an underground seminary because, again, seminary, of course, was illegal at the time, so he went under great danger with his classmates to undergo his studies and formation secretly while he worked in a chemical factory. At one point during his seminary formation, Karol asked his bishop if he could enter a Carmelite monastery rather than be a parish priest. And while his bishop, thankfully for us, said no, I think that fact reveals something essential about who Karol was on the inside. He was a contemplative. He was a mystic. He wanted to live his life, his vocation, his relationship with God in hiddenness within the walls of Carmel. And so he saw himself, how he saw himself most essentially was as a Carmelite, a monastic called to a mystical relationship with him. Now, God used that in a different way, but that's how he understood himself, which I think is really important and interesting. So at this point, I want to highlight just more clearly these two key facets of who he was, even from these early years, and that we see throughout his work as a bishop and cardinal and as a pope. He was a mystic, and he was an artist. But his qualities as mystic and artist didn't draw him away from the world or outside the world. When you think of a mystic, you think of someone like levitating or having the stigmata, like a really like superhuman and a little weird, a little scary. And even sometimes the artist, the tortured artist can be one who withdraws from the world because they see something so beautiful and they can become reclusive. Not all, obviously, but some, the famous artists attest to that, right? But as a mystic and artist, it did not draw him away from the world. It drew him more deeply into the world and into the drama of the human condition. So he was a remarkably human person, remarkably normal, as we would kind of put it, a normal person. But he also deeply loved people and was fully present in their lives. As a parish priest, and throughout the whole of his priestly ministry, he was known as someone who truly loved people and was very human. He grew in friendship with lay people in a way that was a little weird and a more clerical context before Vatican II especially. He took people hiking. They sang songs together. They read poetry together. They skied and played sports. He loved to ski. They celebrated birthdays together. And he spoke of the issues that concern them as married couples. So eventually his work, if you've read Love and Responsibility, which is about the church's teaching on being open to life, that grew out of his conversations with married couples and taking their questions seriously and thinking it through with them. So he would speak of these issues with them, and also as a people living under Soviet oppression. Another reason why they went to the mountains was because there are no bugs listening in on the mountains, but it wasn't simply because this is the only way I can form people away from Soviet observation. It was also this, when you're under two occupations, like the Nazis and the Soviet occupations, where it's intent on destroying culture and the human person in a particular way, you see more and more what is it that makes us human and how important that was. So camping, hiking, being friends, singing, these really simple, remarkable things. But he saw that it was that was how we enter into friendship and communion with each other. And to get a sense of how he loved people, I'll share two stories I was once told by a friend of his named Stanislaw Grigol. Stanislaw Grigol was a student of his when he eventually became a professor of philosophy at the university. And Grigol was one of his doctoral students and wrote his dissertation under him. He later became the godfather of Grigol's children. And then when JP2 started the JP2 Institute in Rome, when he became pope, he appointed Grigol as one of the first faculty members, where he remained until he actually just passed away last month. And while I was at the Institute, he would come every spring to give a week-long class on John Paul II's anthropology and pepper it with these lovely, lovely stories of being friends with him for 40 years. He was a lovely man. And so he told two stories in particular that I thought were really beautiful. The first was John Paul II was while they were living in Poland, so I believe he was cardinal at that point, he was supposed to come over to the Griegels for dinner. But one thing led to another. There's no cell phones then, and then hours go by and he's still not there. So he probably got tied up with the million of things he could get tied up with. So most people would probably bail if you're going to miss dinner and the kids are in bed, but he still came. But instead of just saying, so sorry I'm late and I missed the children, he walked right into the children's room and woke them up with a pillow fight. It was like 10 o'clock at night, and it became this remarkable, lovely memory for these children of this man that he loved them and wanted to see them and wanted to surprise them with something so fun that children love. Well, everyone loves, but children especially love pillow fights. And then he shared this other story about after they moved to Rome to teach at the Institute, so his son Jakob was a little older, and JP2 invited them for dinner at the Vatican, as one goes to, And, it was still Cold War, and so JP2 and Griegel and his wife were talking about concerns of the Solidarity movement in Poland and all these things. And suddenly Griegel felt a kick under the table from his son and said, "Dad, I'm bored." And he said, "Jakob, shut up, be quiet, we'll get back to this later, okay. Then the conversation goes on, he feels another kick. "Dad, I'm bored, gotta get out of here." And he says, "Jakob, please, come on, hold yourself together, please be patient." And then it happened a third time, and JP2 noticed what was happening, and he said, "Jakob, what's the matter?" And Jakob says, "I'm boring. I'm bored, you're boring. I want to go home." I mean, can you imagine your kid saying that to the Pope? Even if he is your godfather, oh my gosh, right? So, I think in the moment, Griegel was mortified. But JP2, in such a JP2 way, he just looked at him and without any sense of irony or condescension, I know I would have with my kid, "Oh, so sorry, baby," paying attention. He took him so seriously and he said, "You're right, Jakob. I invited you here as my guest and I haven't said one word to you all evening. I'm so sorry." And then started talking to him about sports or the latest movies or something going on and spent the rest of the evening just talking to Jakob and the whole family. And Griegel remembers this as just said that that's just who he was. He didn't just do that to just appease Jakob. He really loved Jakob and really cared about him and was attentive to him. And he just said that moment was a very clear example of just the kind of man that John Paul II was. So taking the person seriously, even when they're 10 years old, even when there's important things like the Cold War and bringing down communism to talk about, right? So, and that's just the kind of priest he was. So even as a busy priest then, and eventually as a busier bishop and cardinal and pope, Father Karol also continued to develop as an artist. He wrote poetry and plays. You can find a collection of his plays that he wrote before he became pope, but as a bishop and cardinal. And I would say he wrote it in his spare time, but let's be real, he had no spare time. He made time for his art. And while many practical-minded people might see that as a waste of time, maybe, or perhaps maybe irresponsible for a bishop who had so many serious responsibilities at that point, he did not. It wasn't a guilty pleasure that he indulged in either for his own sake. Why is that? John Paul II understood that art is essential to humanity and is always in service to humanity. And it's perhaps the human person's greatest cultural aspiration to the divine. So it's the desire for beauty is really what art is and what the artist is striving for, and to give beauty kind of concrete form through the medium of whatever art you're practicing in the world. And Father Wojtyla knew that beauty is the form of love. Beauty is the content of the mystery of God and creation. So beauty and art are as essential to humanity as the air we breathe. And he understood, as a priest of Jesus Christ, that his whole life was given in service to humanity and making humanity more human in an age that sought to destroy the human person in countless ways. So making time for art, he knew, was essential to his priestly ministry. And so amidst the busyness of this man, who was giving himself to his people and to his art, to his studies also, he also maintained and deepened this really remarkable mystical prayer life. People who saw him pray said they were seeing something happen. Like, they were struck by how he prayed. But his prayer wasn't limited to the chapel or to silence, as we would think of it. His contemplative prayer and attentiveness to God made him attentive to what he called the mysterious presence of the Holy Spirit in the heart of every human person. So it allowed him to see and encounter God's presence within every person he met. And so every experience of human communion, every human relationship and encounter that he had became a part of his beautiful prayer life with God. So, time with people wasn't something separate for his prayer time. It was a continuation of his prayer. So far from making him superhuman, again, as it were, as we see many mystics, his mystic prayer made him more human and love humans even more. Now, of course, he was also an intellectual, and a really formidable one at that. He became a professor of philosophy and engaged with modern philosophical movements such as phenomenology and personalism. And this, is, no doubt, is essential to the legacy that he left the church, particularly in his encyclicals. But there's a reason why I speak of that aspect of his person last. He was only an intellectual insofar as he was first and foremost an artist who's searching for God and searching for what is human, and insofar as he was a mystic, which is a person who you engage with the truth with the whole of your being, not just the intellect, right? But you're engaging with truth and uniting yourself with God. So we can only understand his intellectual gifts and contributions in light of where it ultimately arises within his heart. And so, as most of us know, this priest from Poland became a bishop and then a cardinal who actively participated within and influenced the Second Vatican Council and the Christian personalism that was particularly awakened there. And then he became pope in 1978 until his death in 2005. And this man who suffered so much in his life and witnessed so many evils against the human person through the Nazi oppression and the communist oppression, and then, the annihilation of humanity that was threatened by the Cold War, he preached to the world at his opening mass these words. He said, "Do not be afraid to welcome Christ and accept his power. Do not be afraid." I mean, this man who had every reason to be afraid. I mean, we're also talking about his confessional was bugged by the Soviets to see if they could catch him, doing subversive things. Griegel talks about he had to have some conversations with him at a certain park where they knew there were no bugs. I mean, this man had every reason to be paranoid and afraid, right? But he told us all, do not be afraid. He said, Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. He said, so often man does not know what is within him in the depths of his mind and heart. Let Christ speak to man. He alone has words of life, words of eternal life. And these words, I think, really sum up the gift of his entire papacy and life for the church. Now, I would say that what, as Pope, he's most known for, and where his greatest accomplishment lies, theologically speaking, is his anthropology, which is to say, his understanding of what it means to be a human person. The timing of his theological anthropology could not be more providential for the church and for the world, because the modern worldview is premised upon an understanding of the human person that not only does not correspond with Christianity, it doesn't fully correspond with human experience. So before diving into what he teaches about who the human person is, I think it's first helpful to kind of present and parse out how the modern world understands the human person to be. And by modern, I don't mean like the 20th century. I mean the modern philosophical movement from the 16th century to today with Francis Bacon, Rene Descartes, like all these guys, the moderns. The modern movement views the human person to be separate from God. The modern world understands reality solely through the lens of will and power. And since that's the lens through which it views everything, it understands God, if God exists, purely in terms of power. So his omnipotent, I can never say it, omnipotence. There we go. So if God is all-powerful for the moderns and acts in the world only to manipulate things according to his will, okay, then humanity can never truly, if they're in relationship with God, can never truly be free in the world to act. God's always manipulating things, right? So for the human person to be fully alive for the modern, he must be apart from God, separate from God. Otherwise, God's will is imposed on us. So this modern move of separating the human from the divine is really noteworthy, for it's arguably the first time in human history that such a rupture between the human and the divine, the human and the transcendent had occurred. But interestingly enough for the moderns, the human person is the very image of the God it rejects. The human person can only be understood in terms of power. And by power, I mean power of sheer autonomy, independence, sheer self-expression, self-definition, kind of the reiteration of Lucifer's "I will not serve," the assertion that I can live as if God does not exist, as if I am God, as if I can do anything I choose, I can create anything I choose, if only I could just channel my will perfectly or not have my will limited. Now, while it's undeniably true that human beings, we are free, and we do have this amazing power of free will to act and be in the world that we create with God, that's part of our dominion given to us in Genesis. It's a huge mistake to limit human freedom and human nature to simply what I will something to be. Our will and our freedom aren't separate, for example, from our bodies, from our natures, from the world that we're in, that we're given, or from God. So to understand our will so separate from these things, as the moderns do, inevitably leads to the oppression of the strong over the weak, which is what we're always reacting against, ironically, right? So for the modern world, we can only ever exist among ourselves and in the world as this constant clashing of wills. Locke's premise of the political order is everyone has to kind of agree to limit our will for the sake of public peace, because we're all will. So in other words, we're fundamentally in conflict with each other and in danger of being used and overpowered for another's gain. We're afraid of each other. So this limited understanding of human nature and freedom ultimately leads to our dehumanization and enslavement to whatever ideology is in vogue of the day. To name the two that directly influenced him, Nazism and communism, but there's a lot more isms, that do this. So this misunderstanding of who the human person is has led, as the Second Vatican Council fathers taught, to a crisis in the world and in the church. And to adequately respond to that crisis, they knew the church had to ask this question, but what is man? That's what the Second Vatican Council asked, but what is man? And by that, they don't mean what is the male, they mean what is the human person, okay? So how did John Paul II do that? So first, he understood and taught that the fullness of humanity and our freedom lies in our communion with God, not in our separation from God. Humanity and God are not at odds, have this conflict of wills or God manipulating us. So they're not at odds because he doesn't understand God and humanity primarily in terms of will or power. He reminds us that God is love, a communion of persons whose Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And communion, he taught, is only possible when the person makes space to welcome another, to receive the gift of another person, and to give oneself in love to that person. I mean, power doesn't have a place in that, right? Communion is not possible within a lens of power and will, because if the priority is to just assert your will, you can only ever assert it upon someone else. You can't welcome someone else and receive who they are for your own gain, for your own enrichment. Because a person in that framework can only be a threat to my freedom, a threat to my will and what I want. So, and John Paul II says, yeah, it's true, other people limit us, but this limit to this infinite will to power is really what allows us to be free and to be happy. There's the great example of, an artist, let's say a pianist, for example. He's not truly free when he's just banging and playing whatever he wants on the piano. He's truly free and when he's giving himself over to the discipline and limits of his craft on the piano and playing a beautiful melody and giving himself over to that so that the music comes through him, that he's in service to it, So John Paul II understood that authentic human freedom, it's tied to our relationship with God, to our obedience to God, and not an obedience as we obey you and you do whatever powerful thing you want. I mean, because I think as moderns we have a really limited understanding of what obedience means, but our givenness to God and love. He said, freedom can only occur within a context of love, and love always places us within the ambit of God. So God does not operate within the lens of power and will, but rather through communion, the giving and receiving of persons, making space for another and welcoming them in freedom. This is what the mystery of the Trinity is. I'm not going to get, I can't get into the Trinity without Dr. K and my husband here to make sure I don't commit a heresy, because it's really difficult to do. But I'm just going to say that each person in the Trinity exists. The word person, even, if you look through the history of the arising of the word person in our vocabulary, it means relation. It came from, how do we understand the persons in the Trinity? Person is relational, and each person in the Trinity exists as a gift for the other in a particular and different mode. And so humanity, as Genesis taught, is created in the image and likeness of God. We can also only be seen through this lens of communion, of gift, of being from another person. As a child, we come from our mother and our parents to be for another person, to give ourselves away, and to be with another person, with other persons, to be in communion and with others. But there's a fundamental difference in how humanity and God kind of live this, we image God, we are not God, right? The difference is we are creatures. We're made from the love and creativity of God. So we're first and foremost from God. We're dependent on God for our existence. And so that makes us receptive first and foremost in our natures, and to other people, to the whole world. The modern world recoils at language of dependence and receptivity because it sees that these things, rather than being active, so they see active is the opposite of those things, right? Because it sees if you're going to make yourself fundamentally receptive, that's the condition for you to be oppressed and victimized, because it's a dog-eat-dog world. You're just setting yourself up to be overpowered by another person. It's foolish. But that's not true. It's a deceptive and alluring illusion. Any honest account of our human experience will acknowledge that we're not in control at all, and we're not sheerly independent. We are dependent on everyone all the time. You're dependent on farmers to grow your food. You're dependent on seasonable weather to have a crop of food. You're dependent on someone to stock the grocery shelves. You depend on people to provide medical care. We depend on people all the time in ways we don't even that we just take for granted, because that's just how things are, right? So for JP2, we are, before anything else, we are dependent and receptive creatures. And only when we remember that's the priority within us, can we discover the fullness of our freedom. So for JP2, freedom doesn't only mean the ability to act freely and choose. It means that, and it's actually, he writes a lot about this. It's essential to freedom to be able to act and to will and to choose. But it doesn't constitute the whole of human freedom for him. Human freedom is not only an action, it's a state of being. So authentic human freedom for him lies in acting fully in accordance with the truth of our nature, with the truth of who we are. And this truth is not constructed by us, but it's given to us, that we're created by God with a particular nature and a particular calling, to live in communion with each other and with the world, and to bring God's communion to the world. This calling is written in our hearts and upon our bodies, for our bodies are not separate from who we are. It's the image of who we are. Another way he articulates this is through the language of gift. He says, the truth of the human person lies in that we are called to make a gift of ourselves to another, to give ourselves away in love. So to make a gift of myself to another for their good is the fullest actualization of my freedom. It requires my will, of course. Like, you can only give yourself if you can will to do it, right? But it requires more than my will. It requires the whole of myself and what I have been given. So in this way, John Paul II taught that freedom is a gift and it's a task, as he loved to say. So the opposite of being a gift for someone is using another person for your own gain. So it's to seek to possess another for yourself and according to your own measure of how they should be. So, I mean, a concrete example is a father can see his child, what he wants the child to be, what he would like the child to be, and so according to kind of his measure of who this child should be, instead of making space for this child's difference. And I think we can all kind of think of different examples of that. I could give examples, of different people I know or whatever, but I mean, we don't need to, right? We all know. I mean, we've all experienced that in different ways. And even we can see other people for what we want them to be for us rather than who they actually are. And that's always like the call to conversion on our part as Christians, is to see the other person. And that's what Christ does to each one of us. Anyway, I feel like I'm rambling. So John Paul II taught that the human person discovers the content of our freedom, so the truth of who we are, as gifts in primarily two ways. First, through the person of Jesus Christ. He takes Christology very, very seriously. Jesus Christ is fully God and fully man. So he's not the Superman exception to who the human person is. Jesus Christ is the human person, like the most fully alive and true human person. Because he's a human being who exists entirely in being from God and being for God. That's what the Son is, even Trinitarianly speaking. No, you get what I'm saying. I'm not going to try to say it. So our measure for humanity must therefore always start with Christ if it is to be true and if it is to be authentic. And so his very first encyclical was called The Redeemer of Man. And if you've never read it and you want to start somewhere with JP2, start with that. It's incredible. So he taught in his first encyclical, and I'm quoting here, by his incarnation, he, the Son of God, in a certain way united himself with each man. He worked with human hands, he thought with a human mind, he acted with a human will, and with a human heart he loved. Born of the Virgin Mary, he has truly been made one of us, like to us in all things except sin. He, the Redeemer of man. Now, the measure of what it means to be human is therefore not what is sinful and fallen in us. It's common for us to say when someone messes up, oh, you're only human. Like, it's okay. Well, I mean, that is true. Like, we are fallen, we do mess up. But what is most fundamentally fully human is not our sin, right? It's not. And actually, if you look at what the modern movement presupposes about the human person, they presuppose the fallen human person for what is most truly human. And I think that's where the fundamental difference lies between Christianity and between the modern movement. But what is most fully human, the measure of what is human, is our greatness. It's our ability to give ourselves infinitely away in love and participate within the very love and life of God. It's this supreme calling, this great dignity, he said. So for us to truly discover who we are, John Paul II taught we must draw near to Christ. And so I'm going to read through here. I mean, I know it's a long excerpt from that encyclical, but he says it much better than I do of what he means by this. He says, man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own. So he says, this is why Christ fully reveals man to himself. The man who wishes to understand himself thoroughly must, with his unrest, his uncertainty, and even his weakness and sinfulness, with his life and death, draw near to Christ. He must enter into him with his own self. He must appropriate and assimilate the whole reality of the redemption and incarnation in order to find himself. If this profound process takes place within him, he then bears fruit not only of adoration of God, but also of deep wonder at himself. How precious must man be in the eyes of the Creator? And then he says, in reality, the name for that deep amazement at man's worth and dignity is the gospel. That is to say, the good news. It's also called Christianity. This amazement determines the church's mission in the world, especially in the modern world. He says, this amazement is closely connected with Christ. So the church's mission in the world, really the heart of Christianity is this amazement at who the human person is, called to communion with God. So in this, we see that we not only discover the truth of ourselves in Christ, but also to realize this truth, we have to kind of go through the mystery of redemption in him. So redemption, and if I'm in my head, Dr. K and Dr. Henderson are there, like listening to what I was saying, like I'm going to ask her to clarify this later. But I can't go into all redemption means, but I will just say redemption for JP2 means, yes, to be freed from sin. And sin is that which keeps us from fully loving. But it also means something more simple. It means to be fully free and fully alive in communion with God. It's to become one with Christ. So in becoming one with Christ, the truth of who we are as human persons is realized. We're freed and we're able to live and participate in this reality of gift, of being children of God, fully from God, dependent on him, receptive to him, but also sharing that communion with others. Redemption allows us to live this mystery of communion that we image in God more fully. So redemption makes us more human and more able to participate within the communion that is the life of God. The second way John Paul II says we discover this truth of the human person is just through our human experience. The theme of experience is really, really important to John Paul II, especially in his pre-papal philosophical work. But you can see remnants in it if you've read, what most people call it today, the theology of the body. You see when he talks about experience, how important that is for him. And I don't have the time to go into all of that now, but it's important that we realize and see that for JP2, what Christ reveals to us about what it means to be human isn't something that's just foreign to who we are. It's not something that's imposed on us from the outside. It's something that corresponds with our hearts, that corresponds with the truth of how we were created to be. So this means that we could personally verify, to use the words of Jasani, who was not JP2, but kindred spirit with JP2, you can verify this mystery of the human person that Christ reveals to us through our experience. Now, he understood that really the greatest, the modern period isn't all that bad. It's not all bad. I know I painted a bad picture of it, but he said the great insight of it was this emphasis on the human person and human experience. Those are really important things. And so he took that contribution very seriously, that there is a true beauty of subjective experience. But he said the problem is when we separate our subjective experience from objective reality. That experience, a human experience, is always both subjective and objective. So he saw in his pre-papal work to show the unity between objective reality and subjective experience. So for JP2, I'm only going to say that human experience, it's a reality that has an objective content to it, because, reality, it's given to us. It comes from God, so there's an order to it, right? But it's also subjectively very real and something that each person encounters in a unique way. So a true human experience is not one that we merely feel or have impressions of, but one that moves us to the core of our being. So even in our very human subjective experience, we can discover objective reality. So he says when we truly pay attention to our experience, we discover that we're most fully alive and free when we're living in love with other people, right? When we're living in communion. And when we live this language and vocation of the gift of ourselves. And that's why the Christian message has such resonance in our hearts and why it seems so beautiful to us and even seems so beautiful to those who aren't Christian, maybe even like a fairy tale, as some would put Christianity, right? I mean, there's something very beautiful about that. And there's a reason why that kind of corresponds or touches something in our heart. All right, so to wrap up this point, for JP2, the human person is created out of love, for love, to love. But love isn't merely a subjective feeling or emotion. There's a lot of people that I'm called to love and that I do love, but I might not have warm fuzzies toward them. We all have that in our lives, right? Because we're not perfect, but also not everyone is a kindred spirit. It's Anne Shirley and Anna Green. I'm sorry, I can't believe I just went on Anna Green Gables. So that means that the human person is only fully human and fully realized when we live in communion with others, with the world, with God. So we're fully free when we're fully human. So human freedom, John Paul II taught, is a gift given to us. So God gives us free will, and he gives us, this communion to participate within. But human freedom is also a task, he said. There's an ethical dimension to it. We have a responsibility to share that freedom with others. We have the responsibility to treat the other people in a way that humanizes them rather than dehumanizes them, to treat them and welcome them as the gift that they are, or not to use them and possess them. There's this beautiful article, I was going to bring these out. He wrote this article in 1995, but it wasn't published till after his death in 2014. It's called A Meditation on Givenness. And it's probably, I'm sorry, did I pull that? I forgot I was plugged in. It's in an article of Communio, but if you Google meditation on givenness, it's the first thing that comes up and you can read a PDF. It's probably the most personal thing he's ever written. It's only like 12 pages. If you've had my husband in class, you've probably been forced to read this already. Yeah, okay. But it's gold. It's amazing. It's really good, yeah. But he really captures in there what he means by this reality of communion and this task of our human freedom. He says, he remembers a priest telling him in his youth, maybe God wills to give that person to you. So he remembers, God has given you to me. He said, these words I heard in my youth were not a mere random remark. God does indeed give people to us. He gives us brothers and sisters in our humanity, beginning with our parents. Then as we grow up, he places more and more new people on our life's path. Each person, he says, is a gift for us, and we can say to each one, God has given you to me. This awareness becomes a source of enrichment for each of us, and it would be a grave danger were we to be unable to recognize the richness of each human person. He said the word entrustment is really important here. God wants to give another person to you means that God wants to entrust that other person to you. And to entrust means that God believes in you. Trust that you're capable of receiving the gift, that you're capable of embracing it with your heart, that you have the capacity to respond to it with the gift of yourself. He said in this way, in creating man as man and woman, he imprints on our humanity the mystery of the communion, which is the essence of God's interior life. This communion is where that special likeness between man and God is played out. Okay, so I need to draw this to a close, team, because I've gone too long. So I'm just going to say, draw this auto close and say, what difference then does this make in, starting with our original question, to approach John Paul II's anthropology from the inside. He said, people approach me from the outside. I can only be understood from the inside. So what difference does it make then to approach his anthropology and seeing him as the man, the mystic, the artist? So I would say the key difference lies in understanding his anthropology within a metaphysical whole, within this whole of being, of created reality, which includes God, the world, time, and eternity, rather than just simply understanding his anthropology in terms of doing. Okay, what do I mean by that? I mean, just go out there and be a gift. Which actually, as if that's something we can accomplish by our own effort. But it's also a quite common interpretation of John Paul II's work, and it's no one's fault really. It's the culture that we're in. It's how we kind of predominantly understand ourselves. We do it, and Christ gives us the grace, and we're going to go out there and be a gift, and just be a gift, everyone. And while it's not wrong, I mean, I just said that there's this ethical dimension of the gift. We're called to, receive the gift of another, not possess them, not use them. But it's like the reality of what he's teaching about the human person is much more than that. It means, so seeing JP2 from the inside means we enter into the reality of gift, of communion, that always comes before us. Receiving the gift of God, the gift of communion, the gift of one another, and in receiving that and entrusting ourselves to it, giving ourselves in return, it means participating within this order of love that precedes us, that we're given, and that we receive and we participate within, rather than just try harder to be a gift, everyone. Well, okay, true, but I have to first receive and hand myself over to this reality of gift, which is God, before I can do anything else. And that's what will, move me to kind of be this saint that I'm created to be, right? So this reality of communion and gift is what the mystic actually uniquely sees and experiences and contemplates. It's what John of the Cross saw when he said, the soul is the bride of God. And the desire for beauty, which the artist strives towards, is the same desire for communion and the same beauty at work within the giving of ourselves. So it's because John Paul II was a mystic and an artist that he could see this reality of communion and love so clearly and articulate it so freshly, I don't know, so beautifully and in a new way for us. But it's also why he was so human. And it wasn't because he was just normal guy who liked to ski. I mean, yeah, it's true. But he was so human because he could participate within this reality of gift and communion in a really unique way where someone just encountered him for a minute and their life totally changed. There's so many people who speak of that experience. It's incredible. He's a saint. Obviously, but also that's the way of the saint, right? So in his apostolic exhortation to families, John Paul II didn't say, families, put your kids in Catholic school or homeschool your kids. Help out in soup kitchens, pray the rosary, do all these things. He said, here's some things that are helpful for cultivating a family life, whatever. But what he said over and over again was, families, be who you are. Families, be who you are. And that appeal for families to be who they are, it's radical. To be who they are in an age that denies and seeks to destroy the family. The family is the most human and essential cultural institution, primordial cultural institution that exists. Be a family in an age that denies the family and thus denies the human person. So in that we see, in his anthropology, he understands there's this radical fruitfulness in simply being who we are, in simply being human, fully alive in Christ. And that goes back to what St. Irenaeus said in the first centuries of the church. The glory of God is man fully alive, and the life of man is the vision of God. So what JP2 shows us ultimately is the fruitfulness of a life that's fully human, that's lived in truth and receptivity to God and participating within this mystery of communion, and the central importance of building up what humanizes us: culture, art, faith, relationships. This here reminds us is what the church is ultimately in service to, the human person, and making the human person more human in an age that, ever more dehumanizes the human person. This is the priority of the church: humanity, sanctity, culture, which, again, harkens to who he is, the man, the mystic, the artist. Everything else is in service to this, and nothing John Paul II knew is more radical or fruitful than in simply being human, especially in this age. Thank you.